Hello, I'm Dr. Nicholas Ripley. I am a lecturer here at the University of Salford, and I'm also a physical performance coach for the men's British Lacrosse Sixes team. And this recording is to work in conjunction with the poster I'm presenting at the NSCA's National Conference in Las Vegas. So my research is around international men's sixes lacrosse, trying to identify both match and training demands with this overall research question of, are we meeting the requirements? So a little bit of an introduction. So lacrosse itself has seen this large intake and uptake in the sport itself, with increased participation, especially in the last 2 decades. There are now over 85 member nations to World Lacrosse. And one of the reasons for this could be this potential Olympic consideration. So it was recently announced that lacrosse was one of 9 sports up for consideration for the Los Angeles Games in 2028. It has also recently been included in World Games editions. In 2022 it was Birmingham, Alabama. In 2025 it's recently been announced for Chengdu, China. So this means this kind of adds that carrot to the stick to be able to play at international level. But the full field version is not really likely to be chosen for major international events because small-sided games are preferred. Small-sided games are preferred at these international events due to the smaller numbers required and the smaller or the reduced number of resources for those sports. So for instance, if a full field squad was taken to the Olympics, you'd have the full team, a large number of support staff, and then the additional support staff from the game side itself, such as referees, timekeepers, scorekeepers, as well as then field maintenance. Whereas small-sided game variants such as rugby sevens, basketball, and even more so the 3v3 basketball recently, have the advantage that you require a smaller squad size, a smaller number of support staff, and a smaller number of technical staff associated with that. So the demand on the host nation is reduced. So this is where sixes lacrosse comes into play. So sixes lacrosse, which has only been developed in the last 2 years, kind of fits that niche quite well, being a small-sided variant of field lacrosse. But it's only been developed in the last 2 years, and very little is known about the physical demands of the sport, especially at the international level. So what is sixes? So as the name suggests, sixes is a six-a-side team sport. So 6 players per team with 12 players total. You play 4 8-minute quarters with a 30-second shot clock. So very similar to basketball, so very short kind of shuttles almost within that slightly smaller field of play. So you see there about 70 metres to 36 metres. So within our shot clock, that 30 seconds, very short shuttles. A couple of other key rule differences include equipment. So there are no long poles in men's or women's sixes lacrosse, with all players playing with a short pole, excluding the goalkeepers. There are also some rule modifications on contact and physicality, so things like cross checks and moving picks are disallowed. So if we watch a short video, so what you see here is the goalkeeper playing out, so the Canadian goalkeeper rapidly going down the opposite end, so more of that shuttle run approach. So this is the USA-Canada final from last year's World Games. So as with any small-sided game, obviously you see there it's a lot faster pace with that 30-second shot clock and the retention of possession from the keepers. It does make it a faster game. However, there is only a single published study on sixes lacrosse. This was done in Hong Kong during the COVID period, so it was an in-house match demand, so it's not really representative of a competition scenario. But it does offer us an idea of the match intensities. There is a high need for this. We're only 1 Olympic cycle away from the 2028 Games, if it is successful in that. Additionally, we're only 2 years away from the next World Games. So we need to understand how to optimally prepare athletes for these situations. So the purpose of this study was to observe both match and training demands, so to identify competitive match play in international tournaments and in-house training match demands using GPS technology. This will hopefully enable us to identify if we're able to mimic match demands, as well as identifying what the match demands are. So between February 2022 and July 2022, the British Lacrosse men's side played in 3 major international tournaments. The first one being in February was the Eurolax Sixes Cup in Portugal. Then in May, we played at the Eurolax Dresden, or LaxCon, my apologies. So we played at the LaxCon in Dresden, Germany in May. And then in July, we played at the World Games in Birmingham, Alabama. So between that, 17 international male outfield sixes lacrosse players participated in 13 international matches across those 3 tournaments, and this resulted in 111 individual observations. Between that time, we played 6 in-house training matches. So between 16th of January and the 2nd of July, we played 6 in-house training matches, resulting in 45 individual observations. Match and training characteristics were determined using GPS technology, so we used the S7 vector catapult systems, sampling at 10 Hz. All GPS units were worn in a fitted sports bar beneath protective equipment. In terms of the metrics we wanted to look at, so using the Catapult open field software, we took inspiration from the Weldon et al. Study, which looked at the in-house variants, in-house matches. So we looked at those general metrics such as total distance, average velocity, maximal velocity, high speed running distance between 5.5 and 7 meters per second, very high speed running greater than 7 meters per second. Acceleration and deceleration efforts were classified as movements above 2 meters per second. And then our worst case scenario, which we consider probably most important here, being our peak work in 1 minute, peak work in 2 minutes, peak work in 3 minutes. Some of the other metrics that Weldon et al. Looked at, such as impacts, we didn't see as meaningfully important for this point, particularly with those changes in rule in terms of contact, but that might change further in the future. So the mean and standard deviation for each trend characteristic was calculated, and a series of independent samples t-tests were performed with an alpha level set at p less than 0.05. Gardner and Altman estimation plots with Hedges GFX sizes were used to determine significance and magnitude of differences, with Hedges GFX sizes interpreted as you see below. So if we take a look at our results, we found significant small to moderate differences for average velocity, maximal velocity, high speed running distance, acceleration and deceleration efforts, and peak 2 minute distance or peak 2 minute work. Non-significant trivial to small differences were observed for total distance, very high speed running distance, peak 1 and peak 3 minute distances or work. So we can sort of summarise that competitive matches did result in some of the greater GPS demands in comparison to training matches. However, total distance, peak 1 and 2 minute demands were greater in training matches in comparison to competitive matches. So we can kind of bucket those characteristics into volume and intensity, or a combination of both. So if we look at our volume metrics first. So in terms of total distance, what we see is that trivial increase in total distance for training matches. So obviously this identifies pretty trivial, but there is a small increase in the average volume being performed in training matches. However, for average velocity, so the average movement speed, there is a small increase in competitive matches. So although they're kind of running slightly less in competitive versus training, they're doing it at a higher average velocity. Additionally, there's a small increase in high speed running in competitive matches. So that 5.5 to 7 meters per second, there is slightly more greater distance being performed in competitive matches, with a similar observation for very high speed running. So we're seeing there that running greater than 7 meters per second is a lot more apparent in competitive matches versus training matches. Obviously, it is worth noting there the reduction in the number of players who are actually achieving 7 meters per second. So we see from 110 observations to 66 and 52 to 22. So there is some discrepancy between the number of participants or players or observations reaching those higher velocities. And this is likely due to differences in strategy, differences in playing situation, differences in scoring and score line at that time. If we now look at our intensity-based metrics, so we look at maximal velocity. So there was a moderate increase in maximal velocity in competitive matches. And this is really important. So we see in there the maximal velocities, or the average maximal velocity in competitive matches is just over 7 meters per second. Whereas for training matches, it's below 7 meters per second. But some of the individuals are not reaching above 5 meters per second in training matches. And again, this could be a combination of things, such as residual fatigue from the training session or training camps themselves. But if we're using those to mimic or trying to train our athletes, train our lacrosse players to play at international level, if they're not regularly being able to achieve that 8 to 9 meters per second, if not greater than that, then it's likely we're under-preparing our athletes. And this is something that really needs to be taken into consideration in training design. For our peak 1 minute, there was a trivial increase in training matches, so pretty consistent in terms of the demands they are performing over that 1 minute period. Although it's highly likely, as you see this group down here, in those competitive matches being considerably lower than others. And you could argue they're a bit of an outlier in that case, and that would increase that 1 minute demand. Similarly, in the 2 minute, there was a small increase in the 2 minute demands. So the amount of work being performed, that worst case scenario in terms of the distance being covered in that 2 minutes, is slightly greater in training matches. And again, this could be a variety of reasons, including environmental and coaching factors. If a player is looking for selection, they might try slightly harder in competitive matches. Additionally, in some of these training matches, we're looking at different kind of strategies, different works of play, different strategies in terms of subbing. So that could have potentially influenced these findings. Whereas when we look at competitive matches, particularly when we see the games from Birmingham, Alabama, we're playing in 40 degrees heat. We're trying to keep a consistent subbing strategy to make sure everyone's getting a consistent amount of work. However, for our 3 minute duration of work, we're seeing a small increase in competitive matches. And again, we're seeing that reduction in the number of participants achieving that 3 minute duration. But I think this is something we should be achieving or should be training to achieve and training to perform at. So we see in there, for that 3 minute work, for training matches, we are probably, for the majority of the squad, achieving that. We are meeting the requirements and the demands for the majority of the squad. However, again, we need to take into consideration potential environmental factors, potential squadding issues, and different strategies being placed in training matches. But from a ballpark, we can almost say we might be mimicking the demands for those 3 minute scenarios. But is that the most common scenario being played? Or do we need to change our playing strategy to have a longer or shorter subbing game so we're not reaching these 2-3 minute demands? So if we combine both those metrics together, when we look at acceleration and deceleration efforts, we see that for acceleration efforts, there's a moderate increase in those high intensity efforts in competitive matches. So the number of high intensity accelerations greater than 2 meters per second are a lot greater in competitive matches versus training. And again, this could be an environmental situation. If you're in a competitive situation, you will likely try and push that a little bit harder. One of the more interesting findings is the deceleration efforts. There was a small increase in high-intensity deceleration efforts in competitive matches. So this has implications on muscular fatigue, potential strain injury, and eventual performance. So in some of these competitions we're going to, Eurolax, LaxCon, we were playing 2 to 3 games in a single day. So if we're only training our athletes or preparing our athletes to be performing around that 20 number of decelerations per training match, but then we're exposing them to 30 to 40, and then putting that multiple times, so 3 times in a single day. The subsequent day, they're going to have likely to have an increased muscle soreness, decreased athletic performance ability. So this is something we need to take into consideration about preparing our athletes both on the pitch to be able to tolerate the number of high intensity decelerations, as well as them potentially within the gym scenario to try and improve general lower body strength, to try and to reduce the amount of residual fatigue that might occur from the number of decelerations. So in terms of our conclusions, if we take a look at this in terms of our training matches, so what we were doing in home almost, our volume-based metrics, so total distance, peak 1 and 2 minutes, were greater here. So there are volume-based metrics where we know if we're performing our training matches, we're achieving the right amount of volume, if not slightly greater. But where we are missing out is this intensity aspect. So maximal velocity, average velocity, high speed running, very high speed running, acceleration and deceleration efforts, and those very worst case scenarios at 3 minutes. And this is where we need to play about with our training to try and optimize intensity and volume. Because realistically, we want to maintain the volume we're performing. We do probably want to slightly overshoot our volume to optimally prepare for competition. So when we come back to that taper, so we can taper for the competition. But we need to make sure we're able to prepare our athletes for the intensities they might see. So the maximal velocities, the average velocities, and those high speed runnings, as well as the acceleration and deceleration. So in terms of our training, we try and need to link these two a little bit closer together. Especially it might form more part of a periodized plan where we stick with higher volumes, kind of achieve those higher volumes in our training matches further away from competition. And as we approach that competition, we might have to put in rule modifications, whether it's pitch size, whether it is player number, whether it is shot clock duration, to try and maximize that intensity as much as possible to make sure they are physically prepared to cope with those demands. So in terms of practical applications, our training should aim to meet the physical demands of the sport. And this is especially true for that worst case scenario. So we want our athletes to be physically prepared to be able to perform at that level. And if we're undercooking our athletes, both in terms of maximal velocity, if in training matches they're only used to running at 6-7 meters per second, then they get to a competition, they get to Chengdu, China in two years' time, and they're then required to run and achieve 8-9 meters per second, and then potentially across multiple days, they're likely to induce residual and kind of acute fatigue, which could then present itself as a potential injury future on. So again, when we're looking at these unexperienced muscular strain injuries, we want to maximize the amount of preparation we can perform and mimic those demands as much as possible. So we want to mimic that competition. So manipulate the games, manipulate the training scenarios to try and match the intensity specifically, as well as maximizing that volume. And as I say, this might form part of a larger observational periodization where we're hitting these training matches further away from competition, where it might be actually we're adding additional quarters. So rather than playing 4 quarters, we play 5 quarters to try and replicate some of those volumes or try and overshoot some of those volumes being performed, as well as then mimicking the intensities and maximizing the intensities as we get closer to competition, potentially only playing 2 quarters, but changing some of the rule dynamics, including pitch size, player number, maybe not even including goalkeepers, to try and maximize those efforts. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop me an email or contact me via Twitter or Instagram. I want to thank the University of Salford, the National Strength Conditioning Association and British Lacrosse for allowing me to present my poster at the NSCA National Conference. Thank you.